There's a river somewhere.
So much needs fixing around the globe.
Do you draw the line
and next door?
You and I, all that's broken on the river.
It is time for We Act Radio's Conversations Toward Repair. Welcome. You are listening to We Act Radio, broadcasting live from historic Anacostia, Washington, D.C., on land that once belonged to the Nacotchtank people, sometimes called Anacostan. They were displaced within about 40 years of the first Europeans arriving here, and Anacostia is again under threat of displacement as upmarket building and residences are coming in to replace longer standing residents and businesses. And that displacement is just one form of structural violence that we consider on Conversations Toward Repair. I am Virginia Avniel Spatz, and my intention in this series is to focus on undoing violence by exploring the many forms of violence that we often don't recognize in our city, in our country, around the globe, and highlighting ways that we can build community and peace. For this week's show in particular, we're going to look at how standards of learning can reflect and perpetuate structural violence. Put another way, we'll look at what students should be taught, what students have the right to learn about the world around them, and what it means for students as individuals and for humanity at large when the standards of learning fail to include important skills and perspectives. To help unpack this, my guests are Sally Schwartz, Director of Globalize DC, and Tarek Maassarani, who is a practitioner and professor of restorative justice at Georgetown. We'll let them introduce themselves a little more in just a moment, but before I begin each week's broadcast, it has become my practice to take a few moments to situate ourselves in history and to acknowledge some of the challenges and sorrows that we face as a community. First, on this day in 1915, D.W. Griffith's silent film, The Birth of a Nation, then entitled The Klansman, premiered in Los Angeles. And despite protest from some members of their city council, the NAACP, which was then just about celebrating its 6th birthday, and others. The movie and its reception highlight some of the ways that artistic endeavor, racism and bias, and public perception all interact. And related challenges around responsible representation, censorship, and media literacy didn't start with that movie, and they're obviously still with us. Another different intersection of film and history is found in the 2009 documentary, Scarred Justice. This movie tells the story of a student protest which occurred on February 8th, 1968, and ended in injury and death. While the National Guard fired on student protesters at Kent State in 1970, and Life magazine and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young made sure that the 4 students, even if we don't know their names, that their killing was kind of immortalized. Eventually, 2 Black students who were killed at Jackson State in Mississippi 10 days later also joined kind of our history of the student protest movement against U.S. involvement in Vietnam. But when Scarred Justice came out in 2009, many histories were still ignoring the story of Black students protesting segregation in Orangeburg, South Carolina in 1968, and the state police and National Guard firing on the protesters, killing 3, including a high school student who was sitting on the steps waiting for his mother, and wounding 28 more. This anniversary also challenges youth and adults to evaluate media sources and explore context such as the complex interrelationship of racial justice, anti-war movements, policing, and perceptions of violence, and of course, the way that violence of law enforcement is reported even now. You can find links about these stories on weactradio.com. We like to give people ways to explore a little bit more. And finally, I do want to note that these have been some difficult weeks here in DC. We've had homicides in all 4 quadrants and 7 of our 8 wards, which have ignited a bunch of controversies and old griefs. And we've had attacks on encampments in the city. Meanwhile, the US Congress is kind of trying to overturn the little bit of sovereignty that we have. And that is putting voting rights and the revised criminal code at risk. And meanwhile, of course, in the larger world, we've had natural disasters, we have the effects of climate change, we have ongoing armed conflicts, and just so many things that weigh on all of us in this virtual studio and for those who are listening. And of course, we also have people who are right this very minute producing care and education and cultural expression and building things up. And I mentioned, as I said, every week I just try to bring in what I feel like it's not good for us to just ignore. But since we're talking about social studies, it seems to me that we're talking about how we address these things, whether we address them for students, whether we expect students to just kind of plow on no matter what's happening in their lives, that kind of thing. And so with that, I'm going to finally, thank you for your patience, introduce our guests. Sally Schwartz directs Globalize DC, a nonprofit that works to increase access for DC public and public charter school students to global education, language learning, and study abroad. She also served as DC Public School Director of International Programs, and of special interest to people who were watching last week on the Education Town Hall, she was a social studies teacher at Duke Ellington, and last week's program was about some things that are going on at the local School for Performing Arts. Tarek Maassarani has training and experience in human rights and public interest law and is focusing in recent years on youth empowerment, peace building, restorative justice, and social justice locally and abroad. And he is, I believe, also a professor of restorative justice at Georgetown Law Center. But I will, I will turn it first to Tarek to either correct anything I said that wasn't right or, add a little bit of an introduction for yourself.
Thank you, Virginia. It's an honor to be here, and Sally, after so many years, to be sitting next to you. Sally and I connected earlier on in my life when I was just really getting going. And I came to the DC area for law school and did practice. But early on already, I think already in law school, I was very drawn to doing work in schools, particularly around peace education. And so one of my earliest engagements was with a school in Southeast DC where we'd come in on a weekly basis and do workshops with the 5th graders on all kinds of different ways of communicating collaboratively, resolving conflicts nonviolently, also providing kind of a listening and empathy listening space for teachers who I found were incredibly overwhelmed with what they were having to face day in and day out. Since then, my involvement in DC education has only increased from doing lots of workshops, summer workshops, in particular with high schoolers, ultimately leading up to founding Restorative DC, and an organization that has worked since 2015 to support schools and transitioning into a whole school implementation of restorative practices. So we've worked there within the organization called School Talk. We've worked with these schools and the central office, probably about 3 dozen schools that have received intensive technical assistance, and then many more schools and educators who we've trained around everything revolving kind of in this universe of restorative practices, trauma, social emotional learning, mindfulness, and so forth. And yeah, in the last few years, I've been much more involved in restorative justice also elsewhere, setting up diversion programs. So that's ways of countering the school to prison pipeline in conjunction with criminal systems, but also in community spaces. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you. And Sally, do you want to add or correct to your introduction?
No, but I will thank you very much for the introduction. And I'm really happy to be here and to be able to reconnect with you, Virginia, and with you, Tarek. I can't even remember when we first met, but I did want to sort of add something because I kind of recently reached out to Tarek regarding these standards because I was in DC Public Schools as director of international programs. This was like from 99 to 2008, I think. And at that time within DC Public Schools, there was a very robust program or set of programs around student conflict resolution, peer mediation, peace education, funded primarily with federal grants, I believe. And at that time, I was in conversation with a woman who ran that program within the system and said that work I was doing with international organizations around peace and war and peace building and conflict resolution, adults were learning the same skills that our fifth graders were learning in their peer mediation classes. And we talked about how we can really begin to look at career opportunities for DC students who often are just not seen when it comes to thinking about filling global careers. And sort of we talked about that pipeline for students who are learning mediation, conflict resolution skills that will take them through college and into jobs in the international arena. And so I think this is also where I'm coming from, what the work I've been doing. I always have to say I'm a third generation Washingtonian. And, we do tend to have the same conversations decade after decade. But one of the things that I have always felt growing up here, and that continues to be the case, is that we are such a divided city. And we kind of live with this, and we live with this sort of constrained worldview within our city and don't even see what's available in our own city. And the problem is also on the other side, that we are not seen by those people as potential workers or people that need to be educated or part of the same universe. So this is sort of the work that I have always tried to do, is to connect the global to the local in DC. But the divide remains huge, and it is structural. And so we need to be really intentional about how we address that. So I want to add that.
Thank you. I have two adult children who went through high schools in DC. We actually homeschooled for their earlier years. And when they were in school, restorative justice, and they had classes in meditation, and they had a lot of things available to them that I think are gone now, or in any case, they had access to a lot of things that I think were, I don't know, I guess there was pushback. People thought they were, frou-frou or something. We go through these phases, but the DC public schools have tried to incorporate some of this, and that was one of the things that we talked about before coming on air, was that both the work that Sally does and the work that Tarek does is often not actually in the class. Some of it's in the classroom, but a lot of it is kind of maybe extracurricular or even beyond the school. And one of the things that is hoped with these new standards is that the social and emotional learning and the global perspectives and some of the things that have been viewed as this like extraneous, we can take it, we can leave it, we can fund it, we can not fund it, that they'll be more integrated. So I did want to get to that conversation, but I thought just especially for anybody who maybe isn't from DC, or even if you are, you probably don't know that there's like 3 more days to comment on these draft social studies standards. And I thought maybe, Sally, since you have been through it before, you could just explain the process a little bit so we all are kind of on the same page.
Sure. Well, this is moving really quickly after moving very slowly through the pandemic. And I think it's really flown under the radar for a lot of people. But what gets taught in social studies classrooms, pre-K to 12 in all DC schools, is really important. And it's a great opportunity, as you say, to make change. So just I want to say that educational standards that all states, and DC, is a state for educational purposes, all states develop standards which say what students need to learn in each subject area, and, as one of our mutual friends says, has a right to learn. And so for each subject area, a set of standards are developed and voted on and agreed to. In the case of DC, standards are written by the Office of the State Superintendent for Education, OSSE, and they need to be approved by our elected State Board of Education. I don't think the council is involved in this at all. I think once the board approves them. So back, I think in 2019, the board decided it was time to revise the social studies standards, which have not been updated since 2006, which is a really long time, particularly in the world of social studies. And they began the process by creating an advisory group. I was a member of this advisory group, but it was mainly teachers, to talk about what the new standards needed to look like, what needed to be corrected, and how social studies was taught. And the great news is that, what came out of this and the impulse to rewrite the standards was they needed to be anti-racist. They needed to promote more civic engagement. They needed to do more Indigenous history. They needed to correct they need to decenter Europe and the West. I mean, a lot of that work has been done, and I think there's a lot good in the standards. But the advisory committee came up with a set of guiding principles, which are available online to look at, that sort of said, this is what we want. Social justice, human rights was one of the things that was important. Understanding the environment was something else that was important. Global perspectives was important. So the advisory committee voted on standards. On guiding principles, and this was sent to OSSE. OSSE has been rewriting for probably a couple of years. It's a huge job. I mean, I would not want it. It's very complex, and have sent some draft standards back to the board for comment, and have made them available for comment by the public. And that is only available until the 10th, which is Friday, for the public to weigh in. And the document is, I think, 160 pages long, very dense. And so I think it's just very hard over the holidays for people to turn and really get into the standards. So there is this deadline, but for several months after the deadline, the board is going to continue to engage with OSSE and listen to community input about what they think needs to be done with the standards. So the process of give and take and the opportunity for the public to weigh in will probably continue on for 2 or 3 more months, with the idea that final standards will be adopted, later in the spring. And then they go out to schools and DCPS. And that's when curriculum is written, and then teachers begin to think about how they're going to teach those standards, because every school has the right to sort of do it in a different way. So there is more time for the public to weigh in and to sort of pay attention to what is going on.
I also wanted to mention here that there has been some testimony, I think both of you have testified to the State Board of Education, and some of the other testimony that I read was from students who had taken a lot of time to look at the old standards and were, in this particular case, they were students who I believe were in a Globalize DC program on Japanese, and they are students who are, I think, of Asian descent themselves, and were concerned that that some of the hate and agitation we saw during the pandemic that was directed at Chinese people or Asian people could have been ameliorated with education. So they wanted to go through the standards. And I was struck when I looked at their testimony. They said, well, we gave you these recommendations, and our first recommendation was to see Asia and Asian Americans included from the earliest grades. We believe that showing films and reading books with Asian and Asian American Pacific Islander representation at young ages will help dispel or prevent stereotypes. What we found in the new standards is no explicit content, and everything that they recommended was just ignored. That was a comment from, I believe her name is Chamia Karnathan, and also we heard from Penelope Morris, who also said, like, we gave you all these ideas and then you just ignored them. So I bring that up in part to raise the issue, which I think is an important one, but also, like, how they don't have to pay attention to public comment, do they? Or, like, do you have to try to convince your state rep to vote? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I will say, yeah, these are students that we have an after-school Japanese program, which I could explain if there's time. But these are students that are from many different public schools in DC, high school students. The two students you mentioned are not Asian American. But they're passionate consumers of Japanese culture, anime, manga, which is really popular among young people. And so when the upsurge in violence and hatred and targeting of Asian Americans and Asians in the United States rose, including from the former president, rose, they felt that as consumers of Asian culture and as young people, they wanted to take a stand. And so they talked a lot about what they could do. And they decided education was the key, that you cannot be susceptible to stereotyping if you have the skills and the knowledge to combat that. So with OSSI, until the 10th, there is an online portal where you can submit your comments. But I will say that there is no feedback loop. So we have not heard anything from OSSI. So there is no way for our students to say to anybody at OSSI, why did you ignore our recommendations? Is there a reason? Which to me is not a way to do civic engagement, meaningful or authentic civic engagement. But this is a lesson for our students in civic engagement and the reality. So this is why I say I am turning my attention to the board, which is an elected body, which does, civic engagement is part of what it does. And we will continue to be able to be heard and have a voice with that group. But OSSI is just there's a big wall there. So I would say that is a practice with them that I've experienced myself.
I did look at the portal, and it's like a little comment box, and it was certainly not welcoming or an easy way to send your feedback. But on this topic that the students raised, because I do think it is an important one, they have pointed out that, as if I understand right, that the new draft actually includes less studies about Asia, about Asian Americans, about many things than the 2006 did, which is a step backwards. But I wanted to ask Tarek about this, the related idea, which the students are at least implicitly raising, which is that media literacy is so important. I mentioned that, since 1915, when that movie came out, it's been an issue. And we talk a lot about it, and we talk about how we have to have, as though kids somehow are like less able to maneuver in the social media world, which probably isn't true. So I wanted to get some thoughts from you about what should be included, if it isn't already, in terms of literacy, civic engagement kind of thing.
Yeah, thanks, Virginia. Yeah, well, first I'll say I did not testify, but I submitted comments on the standards. And one of my points on the standards is the need for there to be social media literacy. And if you're not as familiar with the variety of critiques about the role that social media is playing these days, everywhere from adolescent psychology to international politics, elections, and so forth, I highly recommend watching the documentary The Social Dilemma for a summary with lots of first-person interviews with the corporate executives or former corporate executives of the social media platforms themselves. So I have a particular concern about the new wave of technologies we're seeing and the effect they're having throughout the world, and humans with their algorithms that are primarily motivated to create increased and ongoing viewership that then adds to ad revenue. And then what that happens to the way people understand the content and what kind of content gets selected for them. So I put that as one of my recommendations. I also spend much more time talking about what we could broadly call social emotional learning as a skill set. Now, social emotional learning is something that has gotten a lot of play in the last few years. It's really blossomed in many places, and many schools have adapted and embraced it wholeheartedly. So I want to make clear that this is not me complaining about the lack of social emotional learning, the growth of social emotional learning in public education, but it is conspicuous for me that it doesn't appear in the standards. So social studies standards, which do talk about skills of being able to analyze sources, right? It's not just knowing facts about history. There are various references made. In fact, there are some references made to social emotional learning, but they are limited to kindergarten and first grade. Which for me is mind-boggling because those are very important years, but many of the social emotional learning skill sets that I'm concerned with don't develop until later in your life and need many years of reinforcement. So let me just say, this all comes from 2 decades of my working with people all over the world, but certainly in the US, in education spaces, everyone from attorneys to peacekeeping forces in Africa, folks who've been in the middle of civil war. It's very clear that there are a concrete set of skills that can drastically improve your ability to collaborate with others, to achieve creative outcomes, problem solving, to be able to regulate and process emotions. This is, there certainly is cultural difference in and amongst these, but I would say they're just some baseline things we know are really important for managing in pretty much any setting. And we're not teaching this. I'm sorry, we're not providing this as core to the social standards. So I'm talking about things like listening with intentionality and curiosity, considering multiple conflicting perspectives, accessing empathy for both oneself and for others, being aware of one's own and others' emotions, expressing, processing, and regulating emotions, reflecting on one's biases and assumptions, acknowledging harm or mistakes one has made, and all of those feed into the more general skills of building relationships, resolving conflict collaboratively, and assuring for a form of accountability when things don't go well, and working in groups. These are like, if you ask employers, this is what they're looking for more than high degrees in any particular subject. Across the board, employers are very interested in this. If we look at family life and you talk to family therapists, this is the stuff that makes or breaks a relationship and a family. And if you look at some of the social psychology research generally about happiness, you'll see that people's well-being increases because they're able to have more high-functioning social relationships with these skills. So I can't imagine anything more important for our children, and it's not included in the standards. Again, it's included in many schools and their curricula, but it's not because of the standards, and they're not held accountable to the standards, the social studies standards. So that was I spent the most time commenting on that, and it's perhaps one of the things I just feel so strongly about. And I'll link it to the idea of systemic or structural violence, which is an education system doesn't stand neutrally by the things that it decides not to put into its standards. So certainly families are very much considered the source of many of these kinds of skills, like how do you the values and how do you put those values into place is oftentimes what we think your parents should be teaching you, and they do. The thing is that schools, whether they decide to make it explicit or not, are also teaching skills or approaches. They model how conflict is handled, how harm is addressed. And many schools currently do not model collaborative ways of addressing harm and conflict. They model very well what it's like to try to control people within the educational paradigm, how to use punishment and subtle forms of coercion. And so school systems, if they're not actively, not just teaching, but modeling these SEL skills, then they are passively teaching the opposite of those skills. And that's why I don't see a school system as being neutral on this. They're active players, and the families that we're holding responsible for many of these skills themselves can be caught up in generational cycles of socialization and trauma that makes it difficult for the families to be able to provide the skill set themselves. So I think the positive framing of all this is that an educational institution has this opportunity to break these cycles, to teach new skills that might actually run their way back into families and help parents and siblings and others in those families learn from the children about alternative ways of communicating and collaborating. And that this is an essential part of what a school system needs to do, as well as the media, the family systems, and so forth. And so I encourage anyone who agrees with this to also make a comment in the same spirit to the State Board of Education, and talk to others about it as well. And if you're connected to schools through your children, yourself, or others, also make it known that ask questions. How much is the school doing to teaching social emotional learning?
Okay, terrific. Thank you for that. And I do want to remind listeners that that was the voice of Tarek Maassarani, who is a practitioner and teacher of restorative justice, and that we are also joined by Sally Schwartz, who is the director of Globalize DC. This is We Act Radio broadcasting from historic Anacostia, Washington, D.C., right now using virtual studios. And so that was a very useful explanation of why we need to care about social and emotional learning and try to advocate for it as part of the standards. Because as you said, and as Sally has said, schools might be doing it, but if it isn't in the standards, they can't be held to it. And, you know, as we were talking a little bit before, things can come and go with funding and with whim, which isn't such a good thing. And I did want to go back to Sally to talk a little bit about the way that the feedback system and the specifics of some of the things that are in or not in these standards. At Sally's recommendation, I did look at the 6th grade level, which I know is kind of an important one for, you know, shifting from young grades to kind of an older idea. And I did also want to mention that when Tarek was speaking about things that the kids could learn and then bring back to their families, Sally mentioned earlier that when the schools are doing it well, they're teaching tools that the students will need as adults, and that, you know, in fact, many of our adults, we didn't learn this in school. Or at least I certainly didn't learn this in school. And the things that were modeled for me were not stellar as I think a lot of us know. So I did want to ask about those, not necessarily the 6th grade standards, but I did, there's some very odd things that happened. And I thought maybe you could just give us some examples about that.
You want me to talk about 6th grade?
I think it's a good example for people because, you know, right now it is kind of abstract. So yeah, let's go to 6th grade.
Virginia, if I can just say something really quickly in response to Tarek's discussion, which was really interesting for me. But I wanted to just reinforce the point that it is really important that what we think is valuable gets into the standards. Something happened at the time I left the school system, not coincidentally, which was the introduction of impact and a new evaluation system for teachers, which made assessments on how they were doing in terms of teaching to the standards, made that sort of the key element. Before that time, and this is where I put on my old timer hat, across the city, when we had incredible global opportunities, free travel abroad for students, or opportunities that were just incredible here in town, I could always pick up the phone and contact a teacher or a group of teachers at every school who I knew were on our wavelength, that understood the value of global exposure and experience, who had a sense of who their students were and could put their hands on the students that were primed for this kind of experience. Not the student that had already done it before, who was the A student, but a student who was really at the place that would benefit. That has really fallen apart as far as I can see, because how schools are working are a little bit different. And so there isn't a lot of, there are some of those teachers still, but a lot of them were either pushed out or left the system. So that's why it is important to get this information in the standards and not leave it up to individual teachers. And so I just wanted to make that point. So I happened to be involved when I was in the school system when the last set of standards were written. This was when Superintendent Janey was in charge, Clifford Janey. And that 6th grade course, we were very excited about what happened in 6th grade. Some of you may know that DC Public Schools has had probably almost a 50-year relationship with embassies called the Embassy Adoption Program. Generations of kids have benefited from that. And for many, that's their first exposure to the international world. So at 6th grade, we had the Embassy Adoption Program. We had Peace Corps. We had National Geographic. We had a lot of educational organizations that were producing materials to teach these same skills around global competence, understanding culture, understanding how you speak across culture, having empathy, as well as learning about parts of the world. So we made this as a geography and world culture course that was fun, at least initially. In the new set of standards, I guess there are 3 sections. One is introducing a lot of very general geography standards about how geography works, physical geography, the mapping and the environment and how populations respond to the environment. And then for each part of the globe, Asia, Africa, South America, North America, Oceania, what am I forgetting? Europe. There are a set of parallel, for me, almost generic standards that are just sort of reproduced for each part of the world, asking questions like, learn about the culture. And then at the end, there is an introduction to the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are projects built in. So the issue that some of us have with those 6th grade standards, which I have just recommended they be completely rewritten, is that what has been presented is obviously unrealistic to fully cover all these continents, geography, sustainable development goals within a 6th grade class. And the work has not been done to answer that. And culture has been removed. That's the other thing. Culture, which I think is really important to teach, is pretty invisible in the entire set of standards, but they have been removed from the title of the course and are not really present in the standards in any meaningful way. But rather than sort of being thoughtful about what 6th graders need to learn about geography and world cultures and embedding the skills in a coherent way, it's just throwing a lot of rather very general, very broad questions to a teacher who will then have to figure out how to teach that. So to me, I don't know who wrote it, so I don't want to be insulting, but it does feel like it was done quickly and without really much thought to it. So that is a grade level that people can take a look at and see if that makes sense as a 6th grade course that maybe your child might be taking. It didn't look very fun to me, to be honest.
And one of the other things that I think is obvious at the 6th grade level and through other years is that there was supposed to be a commitment to global education and perspective throughout. And that doesn't mean like saying there's a holiday in Vietnam that we should know here and there and, like little bits of things. It has to be an integrated understanding that we are part of a globe. And it was supposed to be decentering Europe. But the standards ask young kids to comment on white supremacy and how Europe got to be how it is, which to me seems upside down from what you might want to teach them about vibrant life in other parts of the world. So I'm hoping both of you can maybe comment a little bit on how that is working in the standards and how it should work.
Yeah, so I'll jump in first, Tarek. On this point, and this is really why I am so happy to be on this show, Virginia, with you, and why I've testified a couple times, and why I'm submitting lots of notes to the writers. the field of global education, which I've been in for a long time, has really changed because the world has changed and has become much more interconnected and culturally diverse than it was when I was growing up and went to a DC public school. So when we learned about the world, we took a history course and, we did a unit on a part of the world. I had a pen pal in school where we wrote a letter to someone in another country, and maybe 2 months later we would get a response back because international airmail was very slow. So there were no real world connections. It was really foreign. But around the year 2000, based on work out of the Asia Society, interestingly enough, there was a new paradigm that sort of was promoted. And now, 20 years later, Department of Education, international organizations, all kinds of groups have adopted this framework, which is that our students, the world isn't out there. We are living in an interconnected world. It is not about us and them, it is about we. And we can't understand our own domestic situation unless we see it in a global context. We can't successfully move around the city unless we understand what culture is and the fact that people from different countries or have different cultures bring different ways of looking at the world. And that it has to be embedded from the very beginning. And so this is what I had asked for, what I worked for on the advisory committee, and what the board adopted. And I was going to read, I don't know if you have their actual recommendation, but yes, what the board wrote and what they directed ASSI to do was beautiful. That it would start at the earliest grades. So in the context of DC, we have students, we have schools that are very diverse, and we have schools where parents are diplomats. And they naturally may already be in this world. But we have schools that are very disconnected. And unless global perspectives and the sense that our students are part of this world, are part of this big world, they have as much right to the benefits and they have as much responsibility in trying to fix the problems of the world as anybody else. Unless we embed this in the standards, we are going to continue to leave out huge parts of our population. And I will say, for example, when I started my work in DC public schools and up to today, one of the things I hear is, this is not for our kids. This is not for our kids. A trip to Europe, it's not for our kids. That mindset on the part of adults is part of the problem that we need to change. But there's also a mindset that this is not for those kids. On the part of people that may be offering programs or offering opportunities. But it is not hard to shift the ground on this when students do have opportunities to travel abroad, to learn about the world, to go online and have meaningful exchanges with young people around the world, which is now very possible. Our students do really well, and they get it. They get it very quickly and become fully engaged. So getting this mindset, these perspectives embedded in the standards from the very beginning, so that when students in grade 1 are learning about heroes in their community is global, and it should include, people from around the world. So that is just sort of a natural part of their worldview. So that's kind of the general picture of what we're trying to make happen, and is not reflected in the standards as they are now.
And Tarek, would you like to add some about the global perspectives?
Yeah, I'd love to. So it strikes me, Sally, as you're saying, I think about the the value that a global interconnectedness, global awareness has had in my life. And, you know, by privilege of my birth, I've had an inherently multicultural global education and life experiences. So I was born in East Germany, former communist East Germany, to a German father and a Lebanese mother. I traveled to Lebanon as a small child until about the early 80s, when the civil war in Lebanon left most of my family, had most of my family come to the United States. I moved to the United States, but continued to have family from such places as Madagascar, France, Israel, Lebanon, and where they are to this day, strewn throughout the world. Whenever I travel, I try to see if I can fit in a trip to visit this or that cousin, uncle, whether it's in Oman or Saudi Arabia, Jordan, or Belgium. My father continued to live in East Germany. He was not allowed to leave, so my parents separated. And I have that part of my family in Germany, northern Germany, which I visit quite often. And then add to all of that, I've been able to work on projects that have let me spend a significant amount of time in the Middle East, particularly in Palestine and Israel, as well as various parts of Africa. I studied abroad in South Africa, which to this day was one of the most formative experiences I can think of. I volunteered in college in Guatemala for a summer, as well as another summer in Tanzania. These experiences shaped me, and when I think about them, I don't think it's a big surprise that I'm so passionate about these particular social emotional skills, which allow us to not just live with difference, but to benefit, to celebrate, to grow, to realize our fuller potential through difference. And so while global programs are not the only way to engage with difference, there's plenty of difference that are all around us. It really is impactful to be able to learn about different cultures, and it helps us understand ourselves better. It helps denormalize what we think is the given, and helps us realize that even what we are is just a unique outgrowth of a certain set of circumstances. And I think that in that is the seed of us being able to also change, like being able to change our cultures in a way, in the way where we grasp and we embrace the traditions and the ancestors that we want, but then we also grow further and away from those parts of our past that we don't want to continue to embrace. So that's how I'll tie in kind of the global piece with the social emotional learning piece.
And examples of how people before us have resolved conflicts, or just learning about social movements, learning history in any kind of way that isn't like, I mean, I was taught the most disconnected set of, you know, here's like, you should memorize these dates and these people and what they have to do with each other. I didn't know for decades. So the idea, and I guess I'm babbling a little bit because I've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years, like trying to learn about labor movements, trying to learn about things that happened before us, because we've got work to do and we don't know a lot about how to make that happen, or at least I don't. It was not a thing I was taught. So the idea that we would learn about other cultures or learn about world culture so that we know we're a part of that, and also learn that, you know, you mentioned ancestors, that, you know, the people before us have struggled and that they have learned things that we could use. Is that, I don't know, is that a goal of the standards, or is that, I did see one person testify to the state board that they thought the standards had actually regressed because people were afraid of, you know, maybe having pushback from like the outside world, that, you know, maybe they're getting too specific in their teaching. Is that an issue that people are worried how Congress or whoever is gonna look at these?
Well, I do think that there is an awareness that Republican Congress is sort of sitting over our shoulder. And the fact that standards are politically very controversial in many states. So there certainly is the opportunity for any Republican member of Congress to kind of swoop in and create problems. I don't know that that is really defining where we are. I'm not really sure. I think to your kind of earlier point, there is a tension, a good tension between including a lot of content as you talk about learning dates and learning names and places and wars, movement away from that kind of history to one that really forces students to think critically and to make connections and to learn skills. And global education is no different from that. At the same time, we have found that there is a lot of specificity in terms of contents as to, like in American history, important content that all students need to know. We don't see the same level of specificity in the global area. And the fear is then it won't get taught. So, I mean, Vietnam, Islam, essentially like what has been happening in the world is really not named in the standards. So when they're that general, there's a fear that there isn't enough guidance. So striking the right balance is definitely part of this, but being able to investigate the world, being able to understand the diverse perspectives that people bring to it, to be able to communicate ideas and then to take action, those are the cornerstones of a global education framework. And so once students have those tools, they can investigate parts of the world. And again, it may be like looking at issues across different countries rather than just an area studies kind of focus. So, I mean, that is really a natural tension that is evident in the standards, and it's just a question of trying to find the right balance. And I will say, there just isn't enough time for current issues that I think Tarek and I both agree are important for students to have an opportunity to deal with, not just ancient history, but current history. And I don't think the standards just sort of allow enough time for teachers to do that.
Well, I want to let both of you have a few final comments, but before we close out, I want to make two announcements. One is that on February the 22nd, 2 weeks from today, the Education Town Hall is going to be addressing the standards in a regional capacity, looking with DC educators and educators from Virginia about how history is taught, and in particular for Black History Month, how Black history is taught. And I also want to mention, in terms of global studies, We Act Radio's co-founder, Kimon Freeman, is publishing a novel. It's called Nineveh, A Conflict Over Water. It's set in a near future and looks at the global water corporation and resistance to that corporation. I have read an early version and highly recommend it. There are book talks, and you can find information about the novel and maybe find a book talk at ninevehnovel.com, NINEVEHNOVEL, ninevehnovel.com. So those are two announcements, and now I've used up a lot of the time. So I'm going to ask, and I'm going to say one more thing, which is that basically you have three kind of, I don't know, sort of geeky people here talking about these standards, and we need to hear from students. We need to hear from a lot of other cohorts about them, and this will go on as time progresses. So we now only have about 30 seconds. Tarek, do you have a last?
Yeah, my last things. So you touched on this in your last round of comments, the fact that a lot of the issues such as racism are looked at from a historical standpoint. They're not looking at what is racism, climate change, mass incarceration, gun violence, biodiversity, gender violence. What are all these very current, very present issues? Where are those in the standards? Learning about what's happening today. And what I want to do is tie in the SEL there. You can actually use the same SEL skills and frameworks to have conversations about those contemporary issues that we have in a way that's not as polarizing, which is, I think, the reason why folks don't want to bring those into the standards. Fear that we can't have a conversation about these. And so that's where these two things fit in very well together. You need the SEL, you need adults in the school building to be able to have those skills and to model those skills in having difficult conversations about the most pressing and challenging issues that we face today.
Thank you. And Sally, any last words?
No, I just will say that if anybody is interested in learning more, that is really interested in bringing global perspectives and really providing a global education, which I don't think I have time to go on that riff, but feel free to contact me, Virginia. I don't know if you can share my email address at some point, but I'm sally@globalizedc.org. And we would love to hear from people who really understand the value of exposing students to the wide world to help them understand their place in it. So that's all I wanted to say. And thank you so much for including us in this conversation. It's really helpful.
You are quite welcome. And the websites are linked from our website, weactradio.com. And I'll put your email if you prefer that as well. I'll remind people to tune in on the 22nd for more about the standards and take advantage of the next couple of days to use the odd little feedback thing, which is also linked from our website. Thanks to Sally, I have all the links so that people can go in and make their comments now, and then pay attention when it's time to tell your state board representative what you want to see in terms of helping our students develop the skills and the perspectives that will help them make a future for all of us, we hope. So with that, we are running out of time. So I will say thank you to Sally Schwartz, who is the director of Globalize DC, and to Tarek Maassarani, who is practitioner and professor of restorative justice. This is We Act Radio. I'm Virginia Avniel-Spatz. And until next time, peace.
Thank you, everyone.